Well, you won't meet many people out there who don't like nachos. If you do meet one, I suggest calling your local mental asylum so they can come pick up this escaped lunatic of theirs. Nachos haven't been around all that long, though. As the story goes, the year was 1943, and some good old military wives who used to hang out together were in the mood for some delicious, authentic Mexican food. Now, this wouldn't be too difficult to get, as they were living on the Texas-Mexico border in Eagle Pass, Texas, where the husbands were stationed at Fort Duncan. So they all piled into a car and probably yelled, "Girls trip," and drove across the border into Mexico. Their destination? The Victory Club restaurant in Piedras Negras. Their mouths were probably watering as they thought about delicious rice, beans, tacos, and margaritas, and they pulled up to the restaurant. But bam, the restaurant was closed for the day. The ladies were devastated, but to their luck, the restaurant's maitre d' had not left yet. Now maybe he had a rapport with the women as they could have eaten there before, or maybe he just felt bad for them, or maybe, well, there's a lot of maybes, baby. But either way, he opened up the restaurant just for them and went to go find the chef. But because the chef wasn't one of those crazy people who just hangs out after work, at work, not getting paid, he had already gone. He had left. He was out. He was probably at home, reading the newspaper, or whatever people did in the 40s for fun. So now we had an issue, because our maitre d' and the hungry ladies were out of luck. Now, most epically, our maitre d' spotted some freshly fried corn tortillas, originally for tostadas, and the wheels in his head started turning. Now, you know when you have a great idea that just hits you and you think a time traveler probably just came from the future and turned on their cloaking device and whispered an idea into your ear? Well, don't quote me on this, but that's exactly what happened here, and you can take that to the bank. So our maitre d' spots these freshly fried corn tortillas, and after probably making a mental note to yell at the chef later for leaving food out like that, he begins cutting the tortillas into triangles and then reaching into his creativity. Or maybe he's still getting those whispers from the time traveler. Our guy decides to toss some grated cheese and sliced jalapenos on top, and he even had the good sense to put the dish under a broiling unit that melted the cheese all gooey and delicious like. And the ladies were very impressed, and most likely grateful, but for sure impressed as they asked the maitre d' what the name of the dish was. As he had never made the dish, our maitre d', whose name was Ignacio Nacho Anaya, decided then to call the dish Nacho Special. Nacho was his nickname as it was a shorthand for the name Ignacio. Eventually, Ignacio was promoted to head chef of the Victory Club restaurant and then opened up his own restaurant in Piedras Negras in the 1950s. As a quick aside though, even though Ignacio essentially made tortilla chips on the spot, the person who is credited with making tortilla chips known on a large scale was a woman in Los Angeles who in the late 1940s co-owned a tortilla factory and used to take the tortillas that were too ugly to package up and fry them and chipify them to sell as chips. Her name was Rebecca Webb Carranza. And then, that inspired the wonderful person who began making Doritos. And now we're all fat. So now we got to tell the tale of the sandwich. Now, sandwiches are awesome, and they pretty much encompass every food you can think about. I mean, you can get a meatball sub, or you can eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. There's even a court that said tacos are actually Mexican sandwiches. They ruled in favor of that to keep the taco stand open or whatever, but it's a real legal decision. So there's a lot you can do with sandwiches. There's a lot of things you could put between two slices of bread, or two pancakes, or two burger patties, whatever you want. Your imagination's really the limit. So where did the sandwich come from? The most agreed upon story is that there's this English earl, and he has a gambling addiction. Now this guy's name is John Montague, and he's at the card table, and he doesn't want to leave, but he's hungry. And back in his day, which was the mid-1700s, it was considered quite rude to sit at the card table and eat, because you could potentially make a giant mess. You had a plate, you had forks, you had knives, Not to mention that you can't really eat and play cards properly at the same time because your hands are going to be full. There could be like sauces and stuff getting on the table and the cards. So it was just a no-no. You don't do that. So this dude, John Montague, he didn't want to leave the table. So he kind of whispered something to his cook who was in the area. Now, John Montague is a earl, so he's got his own cook, he's got servants, etc. And his cook brought him something back that changed the whole game. We think that he instructed the cook to bring him something simple that he could eat at the card table without having to leave. We don't really know if it was the cook's idea, though, or if it was John Montague's idea. But anyway, the cook brings back 2 slices of bread with a big old chunk of meat in between. And so John can just eat with one hand and hold his cards with his other hand, and people took notice. So John was a man of means and authority and influence. So when he did something, it really got noticed. And it got noticed by other people that had authority and influence of their own. So it spread very quickly. So in the end, it's kind of contested whether it was the cook's idea or whether it was John's idea. But John Montague had recently been to the Mediterranean area, and in that area he might have observed how a lot of the local workers on the docks in the Mediterranean Sea, unloading ships and such, ate their food. And they would eat their food on these flatbreads that were common in the area that were covered, topped with all sorts of different foods, meats and cheeses and vegetables and such. And it was an easy way for them to eat because they couldn't really bust out cutlery and plates and such to eat their meals, to eat their lunches or whatever. So this was just an easy way. They can go to a local maker of these topped flatbreads, and the flatbread would just work as an edible plate and a way to hold in all the food on top without needing a fork or any kind of utensil to eat. So then the question I know you're still probably curious about is, why do they call it a sandwich? Well, John Montague was the 4th Earl of Sandwich. So they just termed it the Sandwich after where he was from. So now we go from sandwiches to something even more popular, and it originated in the same kind of way from the same area in the Mediterranean, and it originated from the same kinds of foods, the top flatbreads. But in the country that I'm going to speak about now, they had a very specific name for these topped flatbreads, which you should recognize. So in 1889 in Italy, Queen Margherita is taking a tour of her kingdom and visiting different places, and when she's in Naples, she notices that the working class there, they're eating these topped flatbreads with all sorts of different kinds of foods that have been piled on top. And she becomes interested in figuring out what they taste like. She wants to know. So she has some of her people go down to the city, and they find an expert at making these top flatbreads, which they called pizza. So the expert they find, his name is Rafael Esposito, and he runs his own tavern that makes pizzas. In fact, the name of the tavern is Pizzeria di Pietro e Basta Così. Yeah, that's the name. I'm not going to say it twice. So Raphael knows he's making these pizzas for the queen. He makes a few different types. That way she can really get some different samples of what they like to eat down there. But he also wants to impress the queen. So he makes a very specific type of pizza. So on this flatbread, he puts tomatoes, mozzarella cheese, and basil. And he specifically did that because the colors of the food are red, white, and green, which match the colors of the Italian flag. And that ended up being Queen Margherita's favorite pizza. So of course all her subjects wanted to try this pizza that the queen is crazy about. It also could have been a symbol of patriotism because of the colors. But either way, it blew up in popularity. People really liked the combination. And of course, today we've modified it a little bit. Instead of tomatoes, it's tomato sauce. The cheese is probably a little bit meltier now. But you can still find margarita or margarita style pizza at a lot of restaurants and pubs and stuff. And they'll still make it on flatbread and put the old tomatoes, mozzarella cheese, and basil on there. And that's our tasty story of how we have pizza now. So now we have a story about one of the most popular snack foods ever and how that came about. And this story is probably the only time in history where pissing off the cook was a good thing. So we have to go to 1853. There's a restaurant in Saratoga Springs, New York. It's called the Moon's Lake House Restaurant. And there's a customer who comes in who gets some food and is not happy. So sources disagree on who the customer was. Some people just say it was a random person, and other sources say it was Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was born in New York. He was a very wealthy and influential businessman, and he was alive during that time. So it could have been him, could have not been him, because stories differ. But either way, this customer, they come into the restaurant, Moon's Lake House Restaurant. They order fried potatoes. But when he gets them, he doesn't like them. And he sends them back to the cook, complaining that the potatoes are too thick, and they're too bland, and they're too soggy. Now the chef, George Crumb, he's been making fried potatoes for quite a while, and he hasn't had complaints like this. But his dish gets sent back twice by this one super picky customer. So George Crumb, he's kind of offended, and he decides he's going to be a little petty. I probably would be too in this situation, but he's like, okay, all right, you think they're too thick, you think they're too soggy, you think they're too bland? So he takes a potato, and he cuts it like paper thin as he can cut these slices, and then he over fries them so they dry out more. And then he over salts them on purpose. Then he sends it back out to the customer, and the customer tries the potatoes and loves them. He loves these crispy, thin, crunchy, salty chips, and he is very happy. So instead of taking it as like George was trying to troll him or just trying to get back at him, retaliate in some way, he took it as George listened to him, made it the way he wanted, and they were amazing. Regardless of who the customer was, the restaurant and the chef decided they would make some more potatoes like that, and they would actually bag them up themselves as like a snack for people to take on the go kind of thing, and they just became really, really popular. And originally they were just sold at that restaurant, and people would come from far away to get these chips and would order them in bulk, like get a whole bunch of bags to bring back home with them. And of course, because they were so popular, you had a whole bunch of big players come on in and swoop into the snack industry and start making their own potato chips. And today we have 14,000 different flavors of potato chip, and you can thank that customer and Chef George Crumb for bringing them to you. And today we'll end on something that's less of a story, but more of an interesting fact. Do you know how cashews are made? Well, when a mama cashew and a daddy cashew really love each other. No, I don't mean like made, but how they're processed and how they get to us is kind of crazy. One little cashew nut is attached to something they call a cashew apple. So you only get one nut per fruit, which is why cashews are so expensive. But also, you ever realize like they have whole cashews and then they have like halves and pieces? Yeah, that's because the cashew is so fragile, and it has to go through this crazy intense process just to remove this toxin that grows in the cashew tree that would make an unprocessed cashew hazardous to eat or even touch. So these people with gloves have to process it, and then they have to dehusk it, meaning they have to remove these cashews from this super hard shell that surrounds it, and they have to try at least to do it in a manner where it doesn't break up too much, because only the whole cashews can sell for the top price. So people have to dehusk them, and I mean people, Because while they have made machines that can dehusk, manually doing it with people ends up yielding so many more quality cashews that a lot of these cashew farms don't trust the machines to do it, and they will just hire a ton of people, and that's their job all day, is to detoxify and dehusk these cashews. Anyway, it's just crazy how some foods have to go through this long journey to get from how they're grown on the plants to your dinner table. So if there are any other foods that you guys would like to know about, how they came about, and you don't want to look it up yourself and read it, but would rather just listen to someone tell you about it, let me know in the comments and I'll make a part 2.